All right, thank you everybody for this talk. Again, this is a very draft version, a very initial version of what eventually we hope to be sort of presentation on precision medicine and health disparities that we could do to community partners. But right now it's just meant to the 3 planning awardees to give them a sense of precision medicine. And again, we consider this in draft. And again, just want to thank let you know a little bit about the Precision Medicine Health Disparities Collaborative that was funded in 2016 by the National Institute of Minority Health and Health Disparities. And we are a regional partnership in the Southeast United States, led by Vanderbilt University Medical Center, Meharry Medical College, and the University of Miami. And we also have critically important advisory and ethics boards made up of community-based organizations, minority-serving institutions, who provide overall and project-specific guidance to our project. But what we really want to do is enable research that improves the health of African Americans and Hispanics by using precision medicine. So the purpose is to provide a general introduction into the field of precision medicine and health disparities. So you 3, our community partners, can then plan and think about how you want to do outreach and education in these areas based on the projects that you intended. Again, the talk is a brief overview for general audiences. It's not meant for those with scientific training in this area. And the way I'm going to do it for you 3 partners when you do these kind of presentations, divided into 3 parts. The first is just a quick overview of health disparities. The second will focus much more on precision medicine. And then the third part will give a brief overview of genetic testing and then try to link it to overall to health disparities. In particular, I think the genetic testing part is really important because many people think of precision medicine is all about genetic testing, which I'm going to tell you is much more than that, and that's only one small component. But since that is the area that's so confusing, we will add that third segment. So this first part, I want to start with an overview of this concept of health disparities and how researchers and healthcare providers think about these causes of health disparities. Now, I started with this because the concept has been around for 30 years. Obviously, our community partners involved in the project have been very involved in health disparities. So I think it's the one that we're all most familiar with and thus easiest to explain. And then, of course, after the next 12 to 15 slides, I want you all to be very confused and understand how complex even something we think we know as health disparities can be. Once that's done, then I'm going to talk to you about precision medicine, and hopefully after 12 to 15 slides, let you understand it's not as complicated and as hard as we think it is. So what are health disparities? Let me go through some of the definitions. This is the National Institute of Minority Health and Health Disparities, who supports our collaborative, and this is how they define it. They define it as a health difference that adversely affects a disadvantaged group based on either higher incidence of a disorder or disease, population differences in premature excess mortality, greater disease burden, or poor daily functioning. A similar but somewhat broader definition is the one the Department of Health and Human Services uses, which they call it as a health difference that is closely linked with social, economic, and environmental disadvantage. HHS also notes that disparities may adversely affect a group of people who have systematically experienced greater obstacles to health, and they define it much more broadly than just racial ethnic group, but it could also be based on religion, socioeconomic status, disparities between rich and poor, gender, male versus female, age, specifically the elderly is one example, often comes up, mental health, cognitive, sensory, physical disability. Sexual orientation is really big right now, and disparities among sexual minorities and gender identity, and then geographic location. Obviously, many people are very supportive of initiatives to help improve disparities that faced by rural populations or other characteristics linked to discrimination or exclusion. And of course, the reason we focus a lot on this when we talk about racial and ethnic minorities, which is the focus of our collaborative, is because of the well-known data that such groups face poorer health outcomes. However, it is really important to understand that this applies to a wider variety and not just race, ethnicity, but it also applies to many other groups. So perhaps the best example of a health disparity is by race and life expectancy. Now, when I first show this slide, the first thing people are going to comment on is that if you look at life expectancy, Hispanic females seem to have the highest life expectancy in the United States. Lots of interesting research, but that's for another lecture. In this slide, what I want to highlight is when you look at Black men and compare non-Hispanic Black male who has an average life expectancy of 69 years and compare that to a white female at 80 years. Or if you compare that to a non-Hispanic white male that's 75 years, which means that on average, a Black male is expected to live about 6 years less than a white male and approximately 11 years less than a white female. That's what we're talking about when we talk about health disparities. Another health disparity we could talk about is diabetes. And here we show the example that both Blacks and Latinos at a much higher risk of diabetes, approximately 4 times the risk of diabetes than for whites. Similarly, low-income people have a risk of diabetes of 6 times the risk of high-income people. Again, talking about this whole genetic thing, arguing there's not just genes, it's really a lot of environmental factors that are driving these disparities. But in general, just knowing that minorities are about 4 times more likely to have diabetes than whites is a major example of a health disparity by a disease condition. The other example is disparities in access to care. Here, we're looking at the percent of people having health insurance coverage. And what you will see is that before Obamacare kicked in 2014, Hispanics, almost 40% of Hispanic adults lacked health insurance coverage, much higher than for whites, that it was about 15%. Obviously, with the implementation of the Affordable Care Act, rates of being uninsured have dropped dramatically in all groups, including Hispanics and Blacks. However, while you will see that while the Affordable Care Act made a big dent in this and improved health coverage for all groups, Hispanics remain 2.5 times more likely to be uninsured than whites. So again, we still have persistent disparities in health insurance coverage, although it has improved for all groups. What causes health disparities? Obviously, this is a very loaded and complicated issue. I think early on, many investigators were trying to push an agenda that was focused on trying to highlight racism as a driver of health disparities. And clearly, like all aspects of our society, there are some, racist bias elements in our healthcare system. This is probably one of the most famous experiments done in this area. And it was done almost 20 years ago now, where they went to a medical conference and they had trained actors provide the same exact health information and history to doctors. They all had the same history of heart disease. They all provided the same medical information. They all had the same insurance. So this was one group of trained doctors. And the other group of trained doctors looked like this. Now, what they found out was that all things being equal, the doctors that they surveyed, most of whom were white, by the way, were less likely to recommend the more expensive invasive treatments like angioplasty or bypass surgery to the ones who looked like this versus the other group I just showed you a few minutes ago. They were also of note much less likely to recommend it to women than to men, again speaking for gender disparities. So of course, this is strong evidence of health providers providing care differently to people based on their race and how they look like when all else is equal. And since then, there have been a bunch of other studies showing similar findings. However, while this study was a strong example that may be some element of discrimination, racial bias in a healthcare system, it is now understood this is likely a very, very small component to health disparities. As I'll show you in a few slides, the factors leading to disparities are actually much more complex. So while we argue there is some of this in our healthcare system, it's probably not the major driver of disparity. At the other end, there's some people who want to focus on just the biological, and much more specifically, the genetic causes of disparities, and they want to show that it's all about genes and genetics that drive health disparities. Of course, there's almost no genetic variation among racial groups. So trying to look at genes as a major driver of disparities is likely not to be very fruitful. Yes, we can do tests, as I'll show you later in the genomics part of it, to show how much of your genetic ancestry can be traced back to Africa versus Europe versus Asian versus Native American. But that is very different from whether a person considers themselves Black or not. As I'm sure you have heard, some whites are surprised to find out a lot of their genes came from Africa, and some Blacks that have very little Africa in their genes. However, that is very different from self-identification of race and ethnicity, which is the way the census says. If you think you're Black, then you're Black as per the census. It has nothing to do with your genetic makeup. That said, we do know that there are some examples of genetic differences that are spread differently among racial and ethnic minorities. For example, cystic fibrosis is much more common in people of European backgrounds. Similarly, sickle cell is much more common in African Americans, as we know. Way back along many centuries ago, having the trait for sickle cell disease protected people from malaria. And this was very common in Africa, so it's provided some kind of protective advantage back then. And as a result, that trait has survived, and that is why African Americans today have higher risk of sickle cell disease. Another example of this is recent research showing that African Americans with chronic kidney disease, there are certain genetic factors which put them at greater risk for end-stage renal disease compared to white Americans. So we do know that there are some drivers of disparities that may have a genetic basis. That said, for almost all the common diseases, heart disease, cancer, hypertension, diabetes, none of those are due to simple genetic mutations. And thus, just like with racism, it is highly unlikely that genes or genetic variation will explain a major component of disparities. Which begs the question, what does explain disparities then? Well, we first have to cause what are the things that influence an individual or population health, what we call as determinants of health. As you can imagine, trying to tease this out involves a complex understanding of the relationships between biology, genetics, individual behavior. And on top of that, then you have to add the other important drivers for health. These are receipt of health care and health services, socioeconomic status, environmental triggers, like we saw in Flint, Michigan, of course, a little bit of discrimination, racism, but things like health literacy, ability to read and follow medical instructions, legislative policies, whether we, rescind the Affordable Care Act or not, all these things all work together to cause a population individual's left. So individual or population's health status. So we think of health disparities, we really have to focus on how all these determinants of health impact and contribute to health disparities in very complex ways. One area of great interest to many trying to understand health disparities is something we now call the social determinants of health. These social determinants of health are the conditions in which people are born, grow, live, and work, and age. Examples include high quality education, access to nutritious food, decent and safe housing, affordable, reliable public transportation, culturally sensitive healthcare providers, having health insurance, again, clean water, non-polluted air. These are the circumstances that we know are shaped by the distribution of money, power, and resources at the global, national, and even local levels. And I'm sure many of you can give me examples. It is rightly recognized a large chunk of these more upstream social determinants of health is what plays a major role in health disparities. So for most of us, when we think of addressing health disparities, these are the kind of areas we want to consider how proposed interventions may act, since these social determinants are indeed the main drivers of our health disparities. One group trying to take a crack at this is the National Institute of Minority Health and Health Disparities. The framework they developed reflects this evolving conceptualization of the factors relevant to understanding and reducing health disparities. It spans everything: biological, behavioral, environment, sociocultural environment, healthcare system, and they act at different levels at the individual, interpersonal, community, societal, within these domains. So, this framework I really like, because in a simple and concise way, it shows how complex it is to understand and address disparities. So if we really want to interact on health disparities, we got to think of all these different levels, all these different domains of influence, and what our interventions are really planning. And of course, to address health disparities, one thing is clear is that it takes a village. The causes of health disparities are complex, and dealing with the issues, in particular the social determinants, will require a multi-sector partnership with expertise from many sources. Everyone from knowing what kinds of information are important, how that information needs to be looked at, and how we can come up with solutions. So for the past 25 years, researchers like me, we've been really dealing with community leaders, community advisory boards, community representatives, because they provide incredibly important information. What are the issues that are important in the specific needs of a population? What approaches will work in their communities? Because in the end, that's what we all want. We want to improve our health of our communities, and we want to address pertinent issues that save lives. And for that, we need everyone to participate. These are some of the partners who are actually working on our collaborative as examples of community partners we work with, but these are the kind of partners and collaborators that we really need to address in a multi-sector stakeholder partnership to address health disparities. So in summary, in health disparities in the United States, certain minority groups experience poor health or health outcomes, and the cause of these disparities are complex and involve factors at many levels. So we need new thinking and new ideas to address health disparities, and input from community partners and other stakeholders is going to be critical for us to address health disparities. Which of course then leads to the next part of the talk, which is on precision medicine as one new thinking and new idea on how to address health disparities. And now we will move on to part 2, which is the basic concepts in precision medicine. And again, in this next part of the presentation, I'm going to provide a brief overview of precision medicine. As some of you remember, this buzzword received a lot of attention in 2015 when the then President Obama introduced this new concept of precision medicine, the Precision Medicine Initiative in a State of the Union address. Since then, many of you have heard many marketing campaigns by healthcare institutions, academic health centers using this term precision medicine. Now, while scientists have been using the term for several years now, most of the public is still unfamiliar, and there's been a lot of misunderstanding about what this means. In fact, when I was reviewing a lot of the precision medicine commercials or marketing campaigns being made by healthcare centers, it's fairly clear to me that a lot of these people doing these commercials are still confused about what it means, and some of these have actually provided misleading information about what health disparities means. So before I even begin to help you understand, I want to show one of the very short clips I found. This is the White House, and a White House official trying to explain what they meant by precision medicine.
Precision medicine is an exciting new area
of
medicine that allows us to use cutting-edge technology to match patients with the treatments that will make them well. Precision medicine gives us the tools to say what makes each of us different from everyone else. And that's a mixture of our genes, the microbes that live on us and in us, the environments that we live in, and all the factors in the environment that we're exposed to, as well as our diet. All of those things come together to determine how healthy or unhealthy we are. And the power of precision medicine is beginning to interpret what factors will affect an individual's health or susceptibility to disease. We have technology now that can sequence the human genome quite rapidly. That means we can get a sequence or the alphabet that forms the gene for every single trait in the human body. Precision medicine is now. We're already using it. It's already affecting people's lives, and we know it works. But if we can expand it to cover lots of different disease and health characteristics, we will be able to treat all sorts of diseases that we have no idea how to tackle right now. So the future of precision medicine is enormous. This is a revolution in medicine. I am so excited to be here at the White House working on this initiative, because I think this is one of the biggest things to happen in medicine in a very, very long time, and will really make the future health of people in America totally different.
Thank you. And I think the first question is a precision medicine continuing with the change in administration? And the answer is absolutely yes. There's strong bipartisan support for precision medicine. So we think that initiative is going to continue fast forward. Again, this is one of the better clips I found that was released by the then White House on this. And again, you saw it being described as a bold new effort to revolutionize. It seems very high-tech focused. You saw DNA, lots of modern technology, fancy equipment. And even after that, you're still left confused a little bit. What is precision medicine exactly? And again, it's a lot more than fancy high-tech tests. So I'm going to basically show, hopefully, the next few slides. It's not as complicated as they try to make it as they make it show. So before that, let's talk a little bit about the definition of precision medicine. And it is, as you heard, an approach for disease treatment and prevention that takes into account individual variability in genes, but also the environment and lifestyle for each person. And with precision medicine, it allows providers to tailor treatments and strategies to each person's unique characteristics, be it their history, their lifestyle, their diet, lab results, or most recently, their DNA. And precision medicine, as you will see in a lot of the commercials, seeks to provide the right care to the right patient at the right time. Now, whenever I discuss this with patients, they're very confused. And they say, does that mean before that doctors weren't trying to tailor their treatment for me? Of course, that's not true. We've always, as providers, we've always been doing our best to try to practice the concepts of precision medicine. And we've always tried to, recommend the best treatments that work for person's specific characteristics. However, what I'm going to make clear, what's been really changing from when I went to medical school 25 years ago, is the quantity and quality of information, which I increasingly have access to when making health recommendations, which did not exist 25 years ago. So while the buzzword precision medicine is a relatively new buzzword, the concept of using the newest and latest information and tailoring that that information to the unique circumstances of each patient is something I've been doing for decades. Doctors have been trying to do. It's just the types of information that we have access to. That's what's really changed. So if anyone asks, have I been practicing precision medicine for 25 years? The answer is yes. So here's one example that many of you are very familiar with. When a person needed a certain transfusion, I had to know the person's blood type, even back then, before I could decide. If they were like me and they were A positive, then they could only get blood from people who are either blood types A or O. However, if they were blood type AB positive, they could get blood from anyone. If they were O negative, they could only get it from somebody who was O negative. So this is what I was doing, obviously, 25 years ago. What is new now? Well, there's been a dramatic increase in what we know about blood and blood subtypes and the things we test blood for. In determining blood compatibility, there's a lot more that's now tested for than the simple blood groups. We also screen blood for a million different things. And so we're able to much more precisely tailor what blood is the right blood for which patient. So now we have much more information available to us, and we can use this information to tailor our care. And our treatments, such as a blood transfusion, are now much more precise, and we have much fewer translation-related reactions. Another example, again, when I was practicing precision medicine back 25 years ago, was when I was doing my rotation in OBGYN, and for prenatal screening, we used to screen for something called Down syndrome, which some of you may know occurs when a baby has an extra copy of one chromosome, and it is much more common in babies born to older women. Thus, we would screen older women to see if they had this, so that then we could make more precise recommendations about them planning for their pregnancy. So this was a test which did involve genes, and which we did way back in medical school. What has changed now is the amount of information we can get from prenatal screening. Now we can make so much data, so much more detail, so much more information with lots more technology. They allow us to provide a lot more information to a mother who's carrying a baby than we had way back then. So while I was practicing precision medicine back then, right now we have way much more information than we had before. So why is this important? So we've been practicing this all our lives, but what is important is the recognition that still, despite all the progress, many of our treatments fall far short of our treatment goals. One example is right now, many of our patients do not respond very well to drug treatments. For example, 40% of patients do not respond as we want for therapies for things like diabetes and depression. For cancer drugs, we know almost 3/4 of patients may not respond adequately in the way we want to see to one specific drug. So this has really invigorated this new system of precision, this new thinking of this precision medicine initiative to see if we can use newer methods, newer technologies and approaches to gather and analyze information in a way that can help us predict the best way to treat the specific patient and also avoid treating those in which the medicine we know is not going to work very well. So precision medicine really helps us account for a lot more characteristics in patient populations. So this is a better graph. In the standard approach, all these people will get the same treatment, but it could only be effective in 20% of the people. What precision medicine will do is help us to try to gather a large amount of information from many different sources that can help us develop a much more targeted approach to treatment. So here's one of the classic examples, the way we think of and the progress that we've made in the last 10 years. So as you saw from the White House slide, many people think of precision medicine as using fancy tests to obtain information from your DNA. And indeed, with these new technologies, we have special machines and computer programs that have ways to collect and interpret data from your DNA and your genes in ways we never thought was possible. So we're finding more and more messages in our blood, in our tissues, in our DNA that we can now use to treat patients. And palliative medicine can help us design the best treatment plans based on that information. However, it's not about fancy blood tests or DNAs. There's many other sources of information and technology that we didn't have access to 10 years ago. One simple example is Fitbits, those activity trackers that a lot of people are wearing this day. Let's say a doctor had an easy access. How will diabetes treatment change? So a patient comes to me, I do a blood test, I find out he has prediabetes, and I tell him, look, you have prediabetes, you really need to start exercising, eating better, losing weight. And the next visit, I ask him, how's he been exercising? And he tells me, of course he's been exercising, just like I told him to. And then I check his sugar, and I check his diabetes, and I see he's actually worse than last time. So normally I'd probably tell him something like, look, it's not working. I need to start you on a diabetes medication, and that would be my next step. However, suppose I'm talking to him, and at the same time, his Fitbit is sending information to my medical record. It's automatically being uploaded through a Bluetooth interface, and suddenly I have a graph which shows me how many steps he's been taking every day for the last 2 months since I saw him. And let's say I see that he's been averaging 1,000 steps a day for the past month, even though I told him to do 10,000 steps a day. That would definitely change how I treat my patient and his treatment plan. Let's say I also find out which days he's able to do more exercise and which days he's not. Then I can start talking to him about those things. So suddenly I have access to information that's much more precise than me asking him, have you been doing exercises? I can actually see how many steps he's taking. Another example was just the other day, I saw a patient that I was treating for anxiety, and he was having palpitations due to the anxiety. How did we do this? We're standard, is the anxiety better? Okay, good, do this. I was actually reviewing his Apple Watch. The Apple Watch, I could see his heart rate. I could see a graph of what his heart rate has been the last month, what his minimum, his maximum, morning and night rates. 25 years ago, you'd have to give people this large radio device with EKG leads. They have to wear for 24, 48 hours. Now, a simple watch can give me a detailed analysis of how his heart rate can be doing. So now I have a much more precise and objective measure to know that his treatment for palpitations is working. So this is how I used to practice before, and how now I have much more precise information than I could without any fancy DNA tests, microscopes, high-tech scanners. Just a very, very high-tech Apple Watch or Fitbit can tell me a lot of modern information I had no idea would exist, when I started medical school. All right, so this is one example of the classic precision medicine when many doctors think of precision medicine, which is in cystic fibrosis. As I mentioned, cystic fibrosis is actually more common in people of European descent. And it's a genetic disease caused by a buildup of mucus in the lungs and other organs. And people can't breathe because they keep getting recurrent lung infections. So an X-ray typically will look like this, and you see all these white lines. And until recently, there have been not many good treatments for this. However, the last few years, they developed a new medicine called Evacfor, which is only really good at about 15% of cystic fibrosis patients. It only works on certain people having a specific mutation of one gene that leads to cystic fibrosis. Precision medicine, we can test a person, see if they have that mutation in that gene, and whether they'll be helped by that medicine. And if they can, then they could have an X-ray that looks like this, that shows much, much greater improvement in the symptoms of cystic fibrosis. So this one specific treatment is only good for those type of patients, and the others who will not benefit from this treatment, we don't give it to them. So this is the way our treatment plans are becoming much more precise. Another area you've probably seen in commercials where precision medicine holds great promise is in cancer. There's two types of precision medicine here that we need to know of. One, which some of you have probably heard of, is for women who are at high risk of breast cancer because of family history or other reasons, and we test them for a mutation called BRCA. If they are high, only there we think they're high risk. One example was Angelina Jolie, who tested herself, found out she was at higher risk because of this, and she basically found she was positive and elected to have, using this precise information, she herself decided that she was more comfortable having both her breasts removed for this. So using this more precise information about her risk, she was able to make an informed decision. Now, I'm not saying that's the right decision for everybody, but it is one way in which testing for this mutation can help you make more informed decisions. Another area that's really, really exciting, where we hope a lot of breakthroughs are going to come out in the next 25 years, is in actually treating cancer. So what most people don't know is that cancer is really a mutation of genes. A patient, somehow the gene undergoes a mutation that can be caused by viruses, environment, something happens, and they develop a mutation. What we can do now is test those cancer mutations, and based on the mutation, develop a specific treatment that only responds if your cancer has that type of mutation. Right now, we have some examples. There's a pill right now which works on women with a certain type of breast cancer that have a particular genetic profile. And so if you have that profile, we can use this medicine to treat that kind of cancer. Another one is a certain type of leukemia, and we have a medicine which is called Gleevec. And that medicine, if you have a gene change that produces a specific protein, then this medicine helps block that protein in that leukemia, and it works very well in people that have that specific genetic mutation with that leukemia. Another example is in colon cancer patients that have the certain mutation called CRAS, that they do not benefit from certain drugs. So therefore, we treat the people with that mutation differently from other people because we know it's not going to work. So based on the specific mutation of the cancer, we can target therapies very specifically. So a lot of the advertisement, that's what people think of in terms of precision medicine and emerging treatments. However, we're still at the very early stages of it. A lot more is a need for research and need for people that, so we could do that research. But that is the future promise of this PMI initiative to treat things like cancer. But it goes way beyond this. One example is public health, and how will precision medicine improve public health? Now, here's one example that, from our community, and this has to do with the Zika epidemic. So we know that environmental health factors are really important for all that's worldwide. And with Zika, obviously, we know major environmental health factor is mosquitoes carrying the Zika virus. So how can precision medicine be used to address those conditions? Well, as a traditional public health, we would track county by county how many people are coming down with cases, and we'd see how that changes. And if it's going up, you as a doctor would tell a woman, look, there's been more, mosquitoes in this area. We're gonna, you're gonna need to take some mosquito precautions, and maybe the county would start to spray, the whole county against mosquitoes. However, what's really, really changed with precision medicine is the amount of data that we have access to. With precision medicine, what I can get right now is I can get an updated Zika activity, not only by neighborhood exact. I could see neighborhood by neighborhood. I could also see exactly on the map where they're coming, but also where the mosquitoes of the virus are coming in. Now we can actually test mosquitoes, and we know who has that virus. So imagine now linking this information of exactly where the cases are that morning, where the mosquitoes are. And so when a pregnant woman comes to my office, I could not only tell her, look, there's been a lot of mosquitoes reported today, and a couple of cases happened the last couple of days within a couple of blocks from your house. In that case, I may tell her, you know what? Probably better for you to stay home for a couple of days and not really go out. And when we see the cases of mosquitoes go down, then I could change it to her. If she lives in a neighborhood that's not as infected, then I would do the general mosquito prevention. Public health authorities, now they see exactly by neighborhood which specific neighborhoods have the most mosquitoes, and they know exactly where to spray for these mosquitoes. So right now we have much more detailed and more precise information about where the Zika cases are, where the mosquitoes are. We know what advice to give individual people, and we also know where to spray much more exactly than we did before. So that's the kind of information that really with precision medicine is going to explode and really going to transform even the way we do things like public health. Obesity is another example where precision medicine holds great promise. As you know, we're in the midst of an obesity epidemic. Now, while there are some genetic links to obesity, we know the obesity epidemic really only developed in the last 40 years. And we also know our genes have not evolved much over that time. So we know that it's really not a change in our genes that's caused the obesity epidemic. It must be something that in our behavior, in our environment, that resulted in this obesity epidemic. We do know that people with certain genes are more at risk based on these environment or behavioral changes to become obese, but there may also be other biological causes. I just read a paper saying that the gut in your intestines, the bacteria inside that gut, may actually play a large role in who gets obesity, something we did not know. So now let's say we have precise genetic data on who's at genetic risk for obesity. Let's say we have detailed data on whether bacteria in their gut, they have that bacteria that can lead to more obesity. Let's say they come to my office. I already have mapped in front of me how many fast food restaurants there are within 1 mile radius of their house. I also know how many fruit and vegetable stores. The screen also tells me how many parks that are near their house. I also have access to crime data. How safe is the neighborhood? Can this person go walking at night? And to top it off, I'm also looking at their Fitbit and when they're able to exercise. So I know all this information, and let's say I have a sophisticated computer program that can combine and analyze all this in a very simple way, real time, real fashion, when I'm seeing that patient in clinic. Could I, as a doctor, use that to come up with a plan that's much more specific and tailored than telling him, hey, you need to lose weight, you need to exercise, you need to eat better? How much better would that be? Right now, what I do is I tell people who are obese, I give them a printout about weight loss, diet, and exercise, which is very generic. The only tailoring I do is if they speak Spanish, giving to them in Spanish. So, what we want to do moving forward is how much tailored and individualized we could give people obesity prevention messages if we could come up with much more individualized treatment plans. Imagine I knew where their parks are, where they could walk. Imagine I saw that crime was a concern in that neighborhood. Imagine I knew how much they were exercising. Imagine I could tell them, based on your genes, you have much higher risk for obesity than another person. All that information I could somehow be able to link and come up with a very precise treatment plan for that person. Okay, now this looks very much like the slide I showed you before on disparities, but as far as precision medicine, the one thing we also know, similar to disparities, is that it's going to take a village. The forms and type of information that be available to us will require a multi-sector partnership from expertise from many sources. Knowing we're going to need to know what kinds of information are important, how that information needs to be looked at, and how we can come up with solutions. Like I said, for obesity, brilliant minds are working right now, brilliant scientists, in trying to find out which genes can predict obesity and how that information can be analyzed. But they will also need help from scientists that are not genetics, but scientists that work with bacteria, the gut bacteria. Those scientists are also hard at work in trying to identify this. But we also need brilliant minds that are not scientists. For example, how do we get data on safe parks and whether it's safe to walk in the afternoon? Where do we get that data from? How do we analyze it? You also need to know data about fast food restaurants and how you analyze that. Fruit and vegetable stores. All those sources are critically important for the obesity epidemic, and you will need to do that. Another example, which already some doctors have access to, is medication refill information. In some places, right now in your electronic medical record, you're able to get how many refills that person has gotten and how many days he's gone without a medication because they didn't get the refill. And it may be for many reasons we link it all together. Maybe they haven't gotten the refill because we also have mapped in front of us that the nearest 24-hour pharmacy is 20 miles away. And so maybe our advice may be, now that I know you're not refilling your medicine and your nearest pharmacy is very far away, maybe you should try a mail delivery pharmacy, for example. And maybe with precision medicine, you will get a flash note to their doctor on some of that advice. So how you get that data, how you analyze it, what is important, what is not important, that's where we're going to have community leaders, community advisory boards, community representatives to all help us, because in the end, we're going to need to find ways to improve our communities in a way that makes sense, and everyone has to participate. And again, these are some of the partners I mentioned before that are already working with us in some of these projects to try to do outreach and education to the community about precision medicine. All right, and last, before I'm done, I wanted to clarify another term that's commonly used when people think about precision medicine. A lot of people see this in ads and posters all over the place. Our new clinic opened up down in Coral Gables. And again, a lot of stuff about using personalized medicine there. And it's saying about how we're revolutionizing how we deliver personalized healthcare is one of the slogans I think that goes with it. And technically, there is a subtle difference, but really, realistically, most people use the terms interchangeably, which is, I think it's okay. However, when we really talk about precision medicine, yes, we are talking about tailoring medical treatment to the characteristics of each individual, but it also means that we classify people into subgroups and see which subgroups can respond differently to a specific subgroup. And it can also mean creating drugs or medical devices that are unique to each patient. So it could be classifying people into groups that will respond, and it could also mean delivering what many people think of as more personalized medicine, which is tailoring or designing unique treatments for each individual. And again, with a lot of the advertising about personalized medicine, they're often referring to DNA and genetic-based treatments, whereas when we think of precision medicine, we're thinking of much more inclusive than just the specific treatment based on your specific genes, like your cancer mutation. So there is overlap. I think it's fine to use both terms interchangeably, although technically and scientifically there is a small difference, nuanced difference between the two. So to summarize the main points of the last 12 slides, precision medicine is not new. We've always been trying to use the latest and best data we have to provide the right care to the right patient at the right time. What is new is the explosion in the amount of data we have access to, the many sources of data that are producing this, and not only genetic data, but data from many other sources that does have how we're going to treat patients in the future and how we tailor our treatments and prevention strategies to each person's characteristics. Most importantly, for precision medicine to succeed, we're going to need a multi-sector partnership with heavy involvement from community partners. So hopefully, with that short overview, I think you have a much clearer and concrete understanding of what precision medicine is all about. That said, in case you fell asleep in the last set of slides, here's a very short presentation from some other group of scientists in San Francisco, again, trying to think and struggle how you explain this to non-scientists. And this is their video they came up with. I think you'll also find as a nice summary of what I just went through in the last 20 minutes.
Precision medicine. You've probably heard the words on the news or even at your doctor's office, but how does it affect your life right now? Precision medicine is basically a modern approach to understanding health. Take asthma. Asthma affects more than 25 million Americans, nearly 1 in 12. They all have one thing in common, a condition that makes breathing difficult. In most clinics, these patients are treated with an inhaler and the same drug, albuterol. But are 25 million people all the same? If you have asthma, your condition depends on where you grew up, how old you are, and your ancestry. It also depends on the air you breathe and if you have carpets or pets. Every patient is unique, so one-size-fits-all remedies don't always work. It's not just asthma. For diabetes, cancer, and most other diseases, today's treatments are based on obvious symptoms, standard tests, and common drugs. Precision medicine, however, starts with creating a clear picture of health by collecting, connecting, and analyzing many kinds of information. This could be data you provide from your fitness tracker, or it could be what scientists are learning in their labs right now about the underlying causes of disease. Genetics, your health history, and other details are added to the mix. When we integrate such data from millions of people, your clinician and researchers can understand your health risks, how others like you responded to a disease or drug, ways to prevent disease, and what makes you unique. So we can stop focusing on diseases and care for you as an individual. The more information we collect and connect, the better scientists will understand health. And as that knowledge network grows, we can ensure that every patient everywhere gets the right treatment in the right dose at the right time.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you very much for listening to that short overview. No comments whether their commercial made it clear, their little 2-minute video made it clearer than my 20-minute presentation. But I hope you get the gist of what it is that we like to inform the community and teach them so that they're not afraid of this term precision medicine, so that there's no misunderstandings. And they get a clearer picture that, while high-tech microscopes and fancy, super-duper imaging machines and, genetic testing is part of it, it's really much more of a much bigger global concept than just that. Okay, now we're going to move on to the third part of our talk. Which is basic concepts in genomic and genetic testing. As I explained, precision medicine is so much more than this. However, it's one area that's very confusing to many talking out with the community, to community partners. So I thought as as our awardees try to disseminate information, they may want to include some of this information on basic concepts in genomics and genomic testing, so that it can be used. And I want to give a special shout out here to Leah Davis from Vanderbilt Genetics Institute, who really helped create some of these slides under what are some of the basic concepts around this area. It's what we call Genomics 101 is what we like to call it. And this whole concept, your genome is all the genetic information that each cell has in your body. And as I mentioned before, all humans have the same set of genes in human genomes in which 99% are identical. So the variation in genes and genomes between each of us is very, very slight. However, some of the differences helped our ancestors adapt to different environments. One example was a sickle cell that I used before. People in Africa, much more likely have this mutation with the sickle cell trait because it helped them survive malaria. Is one example of why sickle cell is more common in African Americans. Now, each cell in your body contains what we call a nucleus, which is, this is the cell, right? You remember that from biology. And this is the nucleus. And inside the nucleus of the cell, that's where you have these things called the chromosomes. Each one is made up of DNA. The nucleus has 23 pairs of chromosomes, so 46 altogether. It's about 3 billion pairs of DNA, these things right here. And there's about 20,000 genes which are organized up in these chromosomes. So that's, I think, as fancy and as basic science are going to be, but understand that each cell has all of these in them. Humans share genes, but each genome is unique. So we all have the same set of genes, and our genes provide the code that make us humans, and they determine the fate of each cell. Whether a cell is going to be a heart cell or a brain cell varies depending on which genes are activated or not activated. However, the code for each gene can vary slightly between people. So there's a slight variation. As I said, maybe about 1% of the 3 billion DNA pairs are different between people. So that's a small genetic variation. And these are the differences that make your genome unique in between one person and the next. So it's maybe less than 1% of variation that makes one person different from another. And as you're all aware, some traits run in families. So this means that the DNA sequences that increase the chances of having a certain trait are inherited from one generation to the next. However, the person who inherits that does not have the trait because it's also impacted by the environment. Two people can have the same exact genes, as we've shown with twin studies, but actually be very different from each other in many, many different ways. So it's not only your genes that are important, but also the environment, how you brought up, your education, a lot of other things. So just having the same genes is just the beginning, and it shows who may be at higher risk, but there's many other things that can cause how people turn out differently. Same thing for diseases. Sometimes the DNA can cause changes. These DNAs are the things that code for the proteins, and it's changes in DNA that can cause those proteins to be inactive or to behave in very different ways that lead to a disease. Examples may be like type 1 diabetes, or as I said, with breast cancer, as some examples. These can be inherited or can occur spontaneously. The environment or something else can cause these genes to changes. But most DNA changes do not cause diseases. It's a very small proportion of changes in DNA that will actually cause you to have actual disease. One thing that's important, and this is a key point that we must communicate, it's important that when we talk to a doctor, you provide an adequate medical history. Our electronic medical records have a whole chart how to collect this medical history because this helps the doctor decide and keep track of the medical conditions that run in the family, and again, makes much more precise recommendations about what treatments you may be needed for. One example is BRCA. If a doctor knows that there's a strong family history of breast cancer in young people in your family, then he's probably going to recommend BRCA testing as one example, after you see a genetic counselor, of course. But those are the kind of things that are really important for you to let your doctor know any medical conditions that run in your families. Also, I talked about a little bit, some genes are more common in certain populations. Your genetic ancestry may make you at higher risk for some medical conditions and lower risk for others. It can also provide useful information, as I mentioned, about whether somebody will respond well to certain medications or not. And again, some of this is evolving as we speak, and we're doing a lot of research. That's why we're funded. but really understanding a better sense of this is where we hope to revolutionize healthcare over the next 25 years. So the next question is, should I have genetic testing? And the answer is simple. It is recommended for things, for certain disorders that are almost always inherited, but only if you have a strong family history that the doctor may recommend genetic counseling. And it is before you have the genetic test, you need to see a specific counselor who can inform you about what the test means and things like that. So genetic testing, me as a doctor will recommend it based on family history, and usually I'll send you to a genetic counselor first, and then they'll do the testing after you're much more aware of what that will mean or not. So if only a doctor, you should talk to a doctor first before having a genetic testing. The next question is going to be, how about those genetic tests that you can order online? And you have seen the commercials all over the place telling you to find out. There's two types of tests we see in commercials. One is for ancestry and one is for your health risks. So your ancestry test, obviously you've all seen a commercial for Ancestry.com, which can do both family history, but also can do your ancestral alleles. What these tests they're really not medical advice. They can tell you what proportion of your genes came from Africa, from Europe, from Native Americans, and from Asia. And for those, I can tell you, it's up to you whether you want to know that information or not. That said, some things you should keep in mind if you want to do this. Based on the company, the results will vary. So how much of your African ancestry you have can vary based on which company you chose to pay that $100 to, which is right now about the going rate. One example is this really nonsense commercial going around. There's a Hispanic woman who said she tested herself, and then she was very amazed to find out that she was a mix of European, Native American, African, and European, which is exactly what Hispanics are. So that woman basically ordered a test that she had no idea what it was for, no idea what information. She just paid the money, and they give her back information that was totally useless. This is one example collected by one of our scientists in our collaborative on 3 different Hispanics. This is Hispanic 1, and he found that in this patient, a lot of his ancestral alleles came mostly from Native American, some from European, and one from very little bit from African origins. He is another Hispanic. Almost everything, all his alleles came from African ancestry, and very, very little actually came. Sorry, I have this wrong. Most of his alleles came from European ancestry and very little from African ancestry is one example. And then here is a third Hispanic where he was really a mix. He actually had some Asian in him, had some African in him, some European in him. How is that information useful to you? Well, maybe some people would like to know that, find it useful. For most people, I'm not sure how that helps. And again, like I said, only if you think it's useful. That I will say is if you're going to get this, you should know what the implication is of having such tests. For example, I've heard some weddings being canceled because somebody's blood was not pure based on this. I have no idea what that means or how this is interpreted, and being ready to be shocked, by some people having this. But again, this is not medical advice. If you want to pay the $100, be my guest. On the other hand, there are tests that will tell you genetic health risks, and in those I have a very strong opinion on, which, as I said before, do not get any medical test, genetic or non-genetic, without medical expert advice. Okay, doctors, health professionals are the ones who are qualified to tell you whether you need a specific medical test or not, and in general, do not get any of this. Do you know if the tests are reliable and valid? Well, I just told you for ancestry depends on the lab you use. Do you know whether this test has been studied in patients like you? Only do tests that result in actionable information, just like the ancestral alleles. So what will knowing what percentage of your genes are African versus European versus Native American, what are you going to do differently? What will you do about it? So when it comes to genetic health risk, it's really, really important that you consult a doctor because do this. And also, patients come to this all the time and they bring these printouts to me, and I have no idea what the tests that they ordered are or what they mean. I've never heard of them. They're not medically indicated, and now they want me to explain to them tests I never heard of, and I don't know why they're doing them. So rather than paying a couple of $100, my advice to you, visit a doctor first, provide him a very good family medical history, and then the doctor will be able to tell you what's good for you. in terms of whether you should have any genetic test at all. That said, what most people want to know is what they need to do to have a happy, long life. And for that, you don't need genetic testing. Do what I tell my patients when they ask me that. Eat right, exercise regularly, lose some weight, stop smoking, don't drink alcohol excessively, do not do drugs, wear seat belts, and very importantly, avoid lots of stress at work and at home. That advice will save you a couple of $100. So thank you very much, and you can send me the check instead of to these companies. But please, please trust me that most of the time, almost all those tests you're ordering are not medically indicated, and we're not sure what to make of that information. Last thing, just because a guy's wearing a white coat in commercial, and I've seen them in the streets advertising some of this, just because somebody has a white coat does not mean they're a doctor. And even some doctors that come out on TV or you see are actually just working for these companies. So be wary of anyone who's trying to sell you these specific things online. The only point of exception is research studies. So if there's research studies trying to collect this or try to do studies to see what this means, that's a very, very different concept. And that's where really, if it's for research and they're trying to identify and find out what these health risks mean in the future, then that's very different. But again, always check with your doctor before you have any of these things. That's the advice I would tell you. Okay, and with that, that was your very, very brief overview of genomics, and I hope that's really useful. And again, I think some of our communities really will find ways of disseminating some of this information for them are really useful. But the last part of the talk is how this is tied in. What's the tie-in then between precision medicine and health disparities? Just a review. Precision medicine is an emerging approach for disease treatment and prevention that takes into account individual variability in genes, environment, and lifestyle for each person. That's what I said about precision medicine. With new breakthroughs and discoveries, we now have access to much more information than 10 years ago, and there's many types of this information like Fitbit, the environment, and not only genes. Health disparities, I said the reasons minority groups have poor health and health outcomes are complex and involve factors at many levels. Thus, we need new thinking to address health disparities. Last thing I said, community and stakeholder input is critically important to make sure precision medicine succeeds and to address health disparities. So how do we put the two together? We need new thinking to address health disparities, and precision medicine is one new, potentially promising approach to address health in general. And in both, there's an important role for the community. So it's not surprising that many of us that have been working with health disparities are trying to see whether precision medicine can have lots of promise in reducing and ultimately eliminating health disparities, which is a goal for lots of us. So using the disparities framework I presented before, one of the important things to understand is that precision medicine can collect much more precise information at many of these different levels that I'm pointing out here, and the complex interplay between biological, behavioral, physical, environment, sociocultural, and the different levels of influence that they act on. So it is one hope that we think with more research, we're going to be able to much more fine-tune this. Here's one example, which I use for my own research. We have all these different forms of data, which we're able to get a better understanding. One of the studies I'm doing with right now involves blood pressure among Latinos. In this thing, with a lot of training, we can teach our patients who've had a stroke before. One of the most important things to preventing a stroke is controlling blood pressure. So with lots of training, we can teach our patients to text us their blood pressure every day. And so I get a graph on how their blood pressures have been doing. And now we have information we didn't have access. We have day-to-day blood pressures. We can see how people's blood pressures are and respond daily to what when their blood pressure is going out of control, and ask them questions. If their blood pressure is high, we can send them automated text. Hey, did you forget to take your medicine today? Or what's going on? What's your blood pressure very high? So that's one very basic level that we can get. But also what we've noticed, information we didn't plan on. So this is whether people respond every day to their messages or not. What we found out is that some people are really good about responding every day and some are not. If somebody's responding every day and they suddenly drop off and are not responding, that information is also very important, which we didn't realize. For example, somebody may have lost their cell phone, simple, understandable, and we find out here somebody got stolen. They broke into the house, they stole their phone, many other things. And again, a major impact if you've just been robbed, that has a major impact on your health. And now we have information we didn't know about because we're monitoring this daily. Another person got admitted to the hospital. And that's why they weren't responding for a couple of days. They're in the hospital, they left their phone while they're in the hospital. We didn't know that. So precision medicine, it's not only that I get the daily blips of the blood pressure and I can respond day to day, but I also have access to information I didn't know what to do with. And with research, we're able to analyze and see what kind of information is useful and what it means in ways I didn't know. So now with response rates, I can know whether somebody got admitted, whether somebody got robbed, whether, whatever it is that's going on in that person's life that I didn't have access to. And again, behind all that is lots of programming, lots of fancy algorithm, lots of background computer work, but it's the ways when we talk about health disparities, we did an intervention for Latinos, which we designed and which provides a lot of this information, which 20 years ago, I couldn't do this project, for example. That said, one of the major concerns to a lot of us, and in the past, the benefits when there have been a lot of new medical breakthroughs or advances, they've not been distributed equally. Often there's structural, systemic factors, which I'm sure many of you know about, and has often limited the effectiveness of newer diagnostic or approaches in reaching disadvantaged populations or improving their health. So this time, we don't want to see the many mistakes that happened before, where minorities were excluded and communities at risk were excluded from a lot of this new research and discoveries. We want to be on the ground, up and running as this whole precision medicine is rolled out. So this time, we want to be involved to make sure we're asking, precision medicine is asking the right questions, looking at the right conditions, and getting data that is important and applicable for our communities. So we got to make sure there's great inclusion of health disparities population in this research, whether it's genes, genetic information, community level data, new technologies, to make sure they're tested and developed in minority populations as well as non-minorities. If this is only done in non-minorities, then you can see why it's not going to be useful. This is one example. It does take a lot of training for some people to teach them how to upload their blood pressure every day, but we can do it. It just takes a little bit more work. If you're a traditional researcher, maybe you don't want to go that route. Maybe you want to deal with the highest educated, most resource populations, not deal with the kind of populations we know are critically important to address health disparities. That's why it's important that we're involved and we're very, very, attuned to a lot of these nuances to make sure that the benefits from precision medicine apply to all. One example is the social determinants of health. Many people that do traditional medical research may not be as interested in things like the economic, social, and political conditions that influence health. As disparities researchers, partners in disparities research, we're the ones that can make sure that new knowledge resonates with our community and that these important social determinants of health are included as variables in the work we do. So summary. I hope this brief overview, you have a better understanding of what we mean when we talk about health disparities in precision medicine. More importantly, how precision medicine holds much more promise in addressing health disparities, and that we hope over the next couple of decades to really move these whole fields rapidly, and how we must all be at the table and participate, because it's going to require input or guidance from many, many different groups and stakeholders to make sure the benefits of precision medicine improve the health of everybody in the United States. And again, on behalf of the collaborative, thank you very much, and thank you for participating. Now we hope that our partners can go out and relay this information to the communities and start working on their projects. Thank you.